Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the virtual home of the Princeton Public Library here on Crowdcast. I do ask that if you experience any audio or video issues, I won't know if you can't hear me, so please put something in the chat if there's something going on. We're so happy to have you here tonight. My name is Madeline Rosenberg, and I'm the Public Humanities Specialist here at the library. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, AAPI Voices, Past and Present. This program is presented in partnership with Make Us Visible New Jersey and with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So tonight we'll feature presentations by Alison Rowe Park and Angel Velasco Shaw, followed by a conversation moderated by Seema Kumar of Make Us Visible New Jersey. I'll hand it over to Seema shortly, who will introduce our speakers and kick things off. But first, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. For Crowdcast, we recommend using Chrome as your browser if you can, second choice Firefox. And if you can, please close any other tabs or applications you have open, especially any that are playing audio or video. Having multiple Crowdcast tabs open at the same time can make your viewing experience more difficult. I also wanted to note that this event is being recorded and our recordings are generally uploaded on the library's YouTube channel. If you have any thoughts or comments throughout the program, please feel free to enter them in the chat that you see on the right-hand screen. We love to have a lively chat during our programs. In terms of actual questions that you would like the presenters to address at the end, please put them in the Ask a Question box at the bottom of your screen if you can, and we'll keep an eye on them. We'll be playing some video clips later in the program. So we have tested them and preloaded them again and again, but we know that technical hiccups are just sort of part of the universe of programming. So in the event that something crops up, please bear with us if that's the case, and do alert us if there are issues with the audio or video in the chat so that we know what's going on. So I think that's all on my end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Seema Kumar. Seema is a New Jersey educator who teaches high school and college students. So I'm now going to minimize myself and bring up Seema. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to begin by telling you about Make Us Visible New Jersey. Make Us Visible New Jersey is a coalition of students, parents, educators, legislators, professionals, and New Jersey community members advocating for thoughtful and comprehensive inclusion of Asian American and Pacific Islander studies in the K-12 curricula for New Jersey public schools. We support the development of accurate, community-centered, engaging, and inclusive curricula, which reflects the histories and contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to the United States and the world. We are working to create open access to AAPI resources for educators. Events like this partnership with Princeton Public Library help us build solidarity across institutional and social communities. Let me now introduce our first speaker for the evening, Alison Rowe Park. Alison has taught Asian American Studies at Hunter College and speaks and writes on issues of race in America. She's a visual artist working under the pseudonym Ming. She's a Pushcart-nominated poet and past awardee of the Poetry Society of America Chapbook Fellowship and Poets and Writers Magazine Amy Award. She is CEO and founder of Urbanity LLC, a communications and organizational consulting firm. She's a recipient of the 2020 Vocal Social Enterprise Fellowship for UrbanityMag.com, a first ever scraper for news, content, and media for, by, and about Asian Pacific Islander Americans. UrbanityMag.com is currently developing a community app. This is coming your way soon. Please join me in welcoming Alison to our virtual stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Seema. I'll be reading about 20 minutes of my poetry, and I invite folks to use the chat box to ask any questions. I'm not sure when I'll get to it, but we'll have it there for later on if I can't get to it within that window. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Make Us Visible and the library for hosting this event. Okay. This first piece is called My Father's Hands. My daddy's hands were scarred, And though the smallest details escaped years ago, I remember them a strong brown, like here is the axe that missed the chopping block. And here's the sharp metal sizzle from the hotel boiler room in America. And here are the paper cuts from my learned books. And here are the burdens I lifted, hardened into a new layer of skin. And here is the unruly child. And here is the moment I took your mother's hand into mine. And here are the hands that held for as long as I could, these hands that struck and healed and labored and soothed. These hands will you please remember. I have to confess, this is actually my first poetry reading on Zoom, or on an internet platform. So thank you for hosting this, and thank you all for I would say usually a much more participatory experience for me to read. So I hope you all are using the chat box and listening to the words and engaging with it in your own spaces. So this piece is called "The Other Woman." For some time, I thought I might see myself, my wounded bird, my gnarled, unmoving trunk, my reaching, in your gruesome face, in your eyes not unlike mine. I don't want to play this game anymore. We are already the stuff of fantasies. We are molded by the same white hands, the same lava fields, come to this place from war, the same legacy of comfort stations and camp towns, be it jungle or metropolis. We are bound by opposite ends of the same taut rope, taking turns at the whoring. This next piece is from my chapbook, which is published with the Poetry Society of America, and it's the title poem, "What We Push Against." And I will just take a second every now and then to check if there's any chat happening. Okay, no, thank you. All right, here we go. What we push against. If I could have our 8 years back, maybe I would be the precious one, the child who got stories at bedtime, whose parents, unlike ours, didn't work the night or graveyard shift. The girl who gets it all, the metabolism, the complete lack of self-awareness. Some might call her a sinvergüenza, undeserving, but always winning in that fable of love. We reunite tonight. The thunder breaks open 1,000 small deaths. The fern on the balcony, brilliant in lightning. Your painted black nails flash. We've been here before. My face a grotesque mask of hilarity, your mouth pouring out laughs as the rain comes down over the greens and browns of Queens, the sky cracking open like a myth. I don't tell you how much I've missed you, that I've found another better person inside of me you've not yet met. How the years, like a ragged wildfire through my life, have left me renewed. Instead, we toast to what's been done, to the smallness of the past, to the speed of light that is faster than sound. The next one is History of One. How's everyone doing? I think we're calling in from different time zones, so good evening or good night, depending on where you are. All right, History of One. 1. Vashti said she could smell your skin and battery acid before she walked in the room. I picture it. Morphine dripping crystal, your wails subside, everyone holds their breath. Your mother heard the butt of his pistol connect with your skull. I see a crosshatch imprint when I close my eyes. You are 21. 2. I'm washing dishes at my cousin's house on Christmas morning. Her husband drinks coffee at the table with my brother. He says, Kobe could get any woman he wants. He doesn't need to rape anyone. 3. Davane repeats, you are your own source of joy. You are your own source of joy. You are your own power. You are your own power. 4. First memories. A cool, dark lobby in Brooklyn. Doors shut everywhere, little legs running, the tap of jellies on emerald tiles, the elevators groan. She wakes to the light of street lamps, her sister's sleeping body next to her. Little legs run down a night corridor. She finds her brother, cheek to carpet, mother watching, hair pulled up in a towel, robe wrapped tight. Father enraged, belt buckle catching in the lamplight. She keeps running. 5. 4 strangers talk quietly in a hotel room on the other side of the world at a conference on AIDS and violence against women. Rape survivor, stalking survivor, domestic violence survivor, child abuse survivor. We have all survived so much. Before my eyes, I watch our bodies become boats, and we carry each other. Okay, the next one is, and I hope I'm doing okay on time, but, oh, and the lighting, it's like sunset here, so the light is all changing, but, okay, so this poem is called Afterlife. It was most recently published in Green Linden Press online. And I'm calling in from Oakland, California. And as you can hear, there's a lot of activity going on outside. So sorry for all the cross noise. Okay. Afterlife. At my autopsy, who watches? If my death is the kind that requires it, when they crack me open like an origami fortune teller, the contents will be thick with blood. I had my tonsils removed years ago, and all the surgeon found were layers of scar tissue. He had to peel one off of the other. I imagine my insides are like that, smooth and brilliant in the operating light. One could read my organs like the transversals of the palm and have the sudden, silent eureka that nothing has truly mattered. None of the self-mutilation, the cascading implosions of human suffering, the collapsing to the walls, to the ghosts you had lived with for so long, the grasping onto your own humanity like a wet seed. There's not even a trace of importance, only the dilution of all those things into a sea of endless volume. Instead, under the ribcage, a knot of light, and in it, all those flickering minute lights. My brother, fingers linked behind his back like in his childhood photos, looking at his firstborn in the hum of incubators. Driving through a deciduous landscape, no other human for miles, swollen clouds casting and releasing entire mountains as they please. The integrity of my pain, that no single illusion succeeded in pretending intimacy, and my reality, unshaken, withstood. Waking alone to the world, to a southeast sun rising like a bright and lazy coin, and the arrival at knowledge, a slow breaking train, an incremental explosion that fills the atmosphere. How's everybody doing? Okay. Oh, shout out for Oakland. Yes, it's so beautiful here. Okay, what are we reading here? All right. Race lesson. You talk Spanish like a Spanish person, or you sound like a Black person, coming at me like supposed to be gifts or badges slapped on my chest, Latin words for racial authenticity and cred emblazoned in gold thread. This in-between has made it. It's all about context, said an ex, outshining me from a sturdy throne of orgullo and inter-hemispheric colonization, and yet what was mine paled. Context requires awareness and self-preservation, said the girl who heard her father say the N-word to a man, ran in front of the man's fist, apologized for the Chinaman, his ignorance of the unfamiliar, meaning immigrant, meaning pigment, or binary ends. Those days, the family disassociated from strong smells of the neighbor's cooking while we hid our own. Skin supposed to be even whiter, beat and bleached, the gold out, worse the brown. Brother says you get more ghetto every year, like a diss, like something to be ashamed of. This is a diaspora choice, to dedicate or to move on. But can't there be a balance without amnesia? Can't I have the silver mountains and the grit, the breath of industrial pollution and the East River, student uprisings and my own dead, the luxury of subway anonymity, of hood anonymity, but life without parallels is life without salt. It cannot be mine. The next one is White Doctor, which I want to shout out the Asian American Feminist Collective, which put out a love, I think it's Love in the Time of Coronavirus. It was an amazing zine that just brought together many different generations and approaches using culture to raise consciousness and build unity and just generally just strengthen the politics of young Asian Americans, especially during this time. So this piece was in that zine, White Doctor. The respirator hisses like a life-giving snake. His chest rises and falls again, plastic tube wet with our tears, and the body's reaction. Waste bag hung from catheter on the side of the bed. I see her eyeing our ancient remedies. White Doctor, what do you know about being brain dead, about our herbs for drinking and our herbs for burning, my daddy's magic and silver needles? How am I doing on time? Moderator folks.
Just over like 7 minutes.
Yeah, I've just been reading for 7 minutes.
No, 7 minutes to go. Sorry.
Oh, okay, I was like, whoa.
Does that sound right? Yeah. Okay.
Somebody write me another book of poems. All right, awesome, thank you. Okay, this is August Typhoon. And in the first line, just Bori there's a word that's translated. So the yellow dog named Pori, as in barley, and I walk down a narrow curving street I'll never know to name, down to the elementary school that looks like my father's, but it's not. Here, the schoolyards are packed with sand, punctured by sharp dry vines and reeds, though we are over an hour from water. I will be gone to my mother's side in 3 days and in 10 across the world, and Bori back to the chain and corrugated metal in front of the store where she lives. After the typhoon, it is still so humid, I take a bath. The bathroom overlooks a church parking lot on a small bridge overgrown with the greens and yellows of squash, moxa weeds, and rose of Sharon. I close the toilet lid and ladle water from the rubber basin over my shoulders and legs. Later that night, I take the bus to the country. My uncle waits in stiff white linen pajamas with an umbrella, glowing in the night. I run across the road to him in the hot rain. We walk in the light from the tractor storage yard where I see a black and white kitten curled and stretching in front of a rooster. Soon we are feeling through the moist dark. I make out a shape in the middle of the dirt road, take out my camera and snap for the flash. I see a frog pretending death. My uncle says, "Neburietwa, leave it alone," and we keep walking. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up with 2 last poems. This one is second class is Andrew at Central Funeral Home. The funeral home overflows into an upstairs room fitted with a silent video feed on a mounted flat screen TV. We chant, watch the stiff Marines on each side of the varnished box. A big red-faced man, enamel pins and patches on his breast, stands next to the priest. The family receives the guests in single file. First, Andrew's brother in his uniform, back from Iraq, next to their father, wife and mother by his side, wringing those thin, strong hands I remember laying out cookies in porcelain bowls. Then the little sister who I held in my arms in the family's cool living room on a hot summer day when we were all children. Okay, so I am going to close with a very brief poem, Country Lesson. So thank you so much for having me on this call. I'm really looking forward to seeing Angel Shaw's work next and to the discussion that'll follow. So, Country Lesson. Put the baby on your back. Wrap the sash around your waist and the baby's. Balance the bundle in your free hand. Wrap your fingers around the knot. Bend your body forward on the dirt path. It'll help you get up the hill. Follow the mountains ahead. You've just left the ones you know. Walk. Watch the silver mist rise from the shapes on the horizon. The peninsula will always hold you. That's all I got. Thanks, everyone.
Our next presenter is Angel Velasco Shaw. Angel is a visual and media artist, educator, and independent curator living in New York City and Manila, Philippines. Her experimental documentaries, including Inherited Memories, Motherlode, Umbilical Cord, Asian Boys, and Nailed, have screened in America, Europe, and Asia. These works are in the collections of various institutions, including the Metropolitan Museum of Manila and the Museum of Modern Art. Group exhibitions of Angel's artworks have been displayed in galleries in New York, Manila, and Los Angeles. Curatorial visual art / film exhibitions and cross-cultural exchange projects include, and here's some fabulous titles, Not Visual Noise Provocations, Philippine Documentary Photography, and a second one called Empire and Memory, Repercussions and Evocations of the 1899 Philippine-American War. She has co-curated both exhibitions. Publications include Vestiges of War, the Philippine-American War and the Aftermath of an Imperial Dream, 1899 to 1999, which is co-edited with Luis H. Francia and published by New York University Press in 2002, and a forthcoming anthology called Markets of Resistance, which will be published by Ateneo de Manila University Press in 2022. Angel was a recipient of a 100 Most Influential Filipino Women in the U.S. Innovators and Thought Leaders Award by Filipino Women's Network in 2011. She has taught media, communication, art, and Asian Pacific American Studies at Philippine Women's University, New York University, Hunter College, Columbia University, and the New School. She'll be teaching at Princeton University this spring semester. Please join me in welcoming Angel.
Hi. That was a little long. Okay. I need to shorten those bios. Whoa. Anyway, thank you all. Good evening. Thank you to Madeline Rosenberg, who's the Public Humanities Specialist at Princeton Public University, Seema Kumar from Make Us Visible New Jersey for organizing the Asian American and Pacific Islander Voices Past and Present. And thank you to all of you for attending this evening's event. This is all very new for me. I was living in the Philippines and working there for the last 7.5 years. And I recently returned. And I mean, just an event like this for me really gives me a really good sense of how things are changing in this country. And maybe events like this have been taking place for even longer than when I left in 2013. But I think given what is happening in the country today, an event like this means all the more and resonates in different ways for people. So I hope you'll join us all in a really lively conversation. And Alison, thank you very much for your poetry. I can see it. So as a filmmaker, I appreciate how your words are images. So I actually wanted to start with Maria Ressa. Maria Ressa just recently was co-awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And not so much for journalism itself, but for what she and Dmitry, and forgive me for blanking on the Russian journalist's last name right now.
I can help you out, Angel.
Thank you.
Dmitry Muratov.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. But what the two of them have done to safeguard human, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And as an artist, as an educator, as a human being, I've been someone who really firmly stands behind freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and as someone who's been censored a number of times as well.
Angel, I wonder if I might
sure.
begin with that and ask you a question. This is certainly a proud moment for the Philippines, given that Maria Ressa, shared the Nobel Peace Prize. I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about Ressa in terms of her identity as both, someone who is from the Philippines as well as, an American.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that Maria Ressa holds both Filipinx and American citizenship. And so it's not surprising, given the entangled relationship between the Philippines and America, that she is both, she has her feet in two places. Could you talk a little bit about that entangled relationship between the Philippines and America? And just a follow-up question, I wonder if, like Ressa, you two travel back and forth between the Philippines and America.
I'm going to take that in two parts, Seema, because the bulk of my presentation in the video clips that I'm going to show you actually really address the entanglement more. But in terms of, I actually met Maria Ressa a couple of times over the years, but it was interesting because in thinking about what connects us together, there are other things, okay? So outside of our quest for truth and justice, we were both born the same year in 1963. We both had fathers that died when we were babies. We were both raised by stepfathers whose names we took as our last names. Maria Ressa, was raised in the United States from the age of 10 on, and then became a journalist. She actually did her undergraduate work at Princeton, and she went back to the Philippines, I think, in maybe 2011, something like that. And I'd been going back and forth to the Philippines, since I was a child, since I was 3 years old, and then steadily from 1985 until when I moved there in 2013. And then I returned in early 2021. The other things that hold us together is that we have similar birth names. Her name is Angelita, and my name is Angela. We were both raised in interracial families, and I was raised in a interreligious household as well. She was, as you may know, she was persecuted and continues to be for her investigative journalism. And my maternal grandfather, who was also was a committed investigative journalist and a newspaper editor for the first Tagalog newspaper in the Philippines, he refused to write pro-Japanese during the outbreak of of World War II. And this is when Manila was declared an open city in 1941. And my family's home on my mother's side was taken as a Japanese headquarters and then burned to the ground. And my family, in part because of who my grandfather was, suffered quite a bit alongside, this is true of many families in the Philippines during World War II. And I just wanted to, open with a quote for my presentation of Maria, that Maria Ressa said in a recent interview, where she said, "A world without facts is a world without truth and trust." This statement is something that really resonates with me as a person who's dedicated my life to creating presence for absence. Today marks the 434th anniversary of the first Filipinos, Filipinx. And I'd like to mention right now that the term Filipinx is very new to me. That's something that's also new since I've returned, as it's not a term that is used by Filipinos in the Philippines. And so throughout my little talk right now, I may be using, or I will be using, Filipino, Filipina, Filipinx interchangeably. Okay, so on October 18th, 1587, this is a little bit of my history stuff, because the majority of work that I do is always addressing how history is alive. So I'm just going to share with you some tidbits, little bits about why this obsession of mine to create presence for absence, this is where it comes from, right? I mean, we didn't know, and many of us still don't really know, that the first Filipinos didn't stay in 1587, but they arrived, right? And at that time, they arrived in Morro Bay, which is now the state of California. During that time in 1587, that area was part of the Kingdom of New Spain. And these Filipino men, were working on the Manila galleon ships that brought luxury goods, which were like spices, porcelain, semi-precious jewels, silk, between the ports of Manila and Acapulco, in exchange for silver over around 250 years. And it's important to note that the southwestern and northwestern states were once a part of Mexico, which Spain conquered in 1521, which coincidentally is the same year that the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan introduced Christianity, Roman Catholicism, and he baptized hundreds of indigenous people living on Cebu Island, including their leader, Raja Humabon. But Magellan, which some of you may know, his celebration was short-lived, because he was killed a few days or maybe a week later on the island of Mactan in a battle with Datu Lapu-Lapu, who was a rival of the Raja. And it wasn't until 1565 that the majority of the Philippines was colonized by Spain under the command of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. The Filipinos did not formally settle in the United States, which it wasn't the United States yet, either. I don't believe, until 1763, when a group of them jumped a galleon trade ship in Acapulco, and then they made their way to Louisiana. And in a general sense, these are the early overlapping Spanish, Philippine, American events that represent the Filipinos, Filipinas, Filipinx entangled relationships. So that's like a long-winded intro there. Now, so within my careers as a visual and media artist, curator, educator, and cultural worker, I've had to confront the American and the Filipino in me. And not simply as someone who's been reconciling my national identities, but as someone who's trying to decolonize the colonized parts of myself. And that, this undertaking is a lifelong adventure, and it's filled with contradictions, and it's very complex, which, if there are Filipinos who are, in the audience right now, I think you can relate to what I'm saying, as well as any other peoples in the audience that come from formerly colonized nations. I think you understand what this journey is. So I want to take you right now on a little journey that's, looking at, the personal and collective Philippine and US history, and how these relationships and experiences and events have impacted my creative process and my intellectual process. That's really inseparable in my life at this point, and the ways that they've really become part of my identity and the fluidity of it. So the piece that I'm going to show first is a clip. Well, there are two clips, and I'll show them back to back, from a project that the poet and playwright and novelist Jessica Hagedorn and I started working on in 1995, called "Excuse Me, Are You a Filipino?" And the project was inspired by the people that Jessica came up with in the Bay Area in the late 60s and 70s. And these people were mainly poets, and they were the sons and daughters of the early migrant workers, who many of whom who came from the Philippines to Hawaii, and they worked on the sugar plantations and pineapple plantations as well. And then they migrated to the mainland United States, and then they followed the seasonal crops, and went up and down the coast from California, actually all the way up to Alaska, where they then, many of them joined the cannery, the salmon canneries. So this piece, or this montage, is called Flip Life. And I'll just show you this clip, and then the next piece is a poem by a poet from Watsonville named Shirley Ancheta. And she grew up in Watsonville as the daughter of two migrant workers. Okay, so
Angel, I'm gonna minimize you momentarily, and I'll
oh
play
yeah, get rid of me.
clips back to back.
No, you don't need to see me.
Oh, I'll play them back to back, and then I'll bring you back up. How's that sound?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Everyone just bear with me for a sec as I share my screen. Thank you.
Filipinos love to party. Excuse me. Are you a Filipino? I mean, are you a Filipino? You don't look Filipino.
The best way to get by high school was letting people think I was a Hawaiian, because that was sexy.
They say, "Oh, are you a mestiza?" I'd say, "No, I'm Filipino." They go, "You were born here?" I go, "Yeah, I was born here." They go, "Then how come you look the way you look?"
Was your mother Filipino? Yes. Okay.
I'm 100% Ilocano.
Open your eyes. You don't want to be taken for any other Asian people.
When I was working in Las Vegas as a busboy, there was this woman, old woman Chinese, who started talking to me in Chinese. And I said, no. She wouldn't. No, you're my nephew.
Do you speak the language? Do you speak the language? Chika boom boom boom.
Is it bayad ho or bayad ko? Bayad mo or bayad po?
I didn't really speak English the way I thought I did, and people didn't really necessarily understand me.
Well, I don't care my English or state of what, because I'm not an American, I'm just a Filipino, but I have learned my language.
I have felt them too, the water buffalo.
They come from far unlighted fields. They lead us out of our city streets into the sleeping blue of water, all of us crossing together. Inside their curved horns, voices whisper us back from our wanderings. On Kearney Street, we are far from the lettuce fields, the cockfights, the blood of the pig. And still farther, trapped in memory, comes the arrival of workers' boats, of cane fields waking in the arms of dark men. I have not always known their tender presence. In the city, cradled by two bridges, the old ones, disguised as dog spirits, lick the bowls we leave for the dead. The wind spins us in this ordinary world until someone nearly broken with desire to be lifted to another country in his heart remembers the feel of the animal's black hair, the slow but powerful carabao walk. In the dark, they chase us into dream, into wet voices that bathe in the blue night, like the blue awakening of fish.
Hi. Okay. Sorry, I forgot to set that up a little bit better to let you all know that. So this project has been going on since 1995, and Jessica and I, it's actually a road trip to 5 different cities in the United States, and I stopped working on it largely because I felt a little bit overwhelmed with the reception of the work in progress. What you're seeing are these little vignettes that I started to edit because I had shot 72 hours of footage, and we started screening, rough cuts of it to try to get, feedback from the various communities across the country of the Filipino communities. And I was uncomfortable because a lot of people were wanting me, which I can understand, but I just didn't want that role to be a spokesperson. I'm not comfortable with that. And so I stopped working on it. And then also because I was working on so many other projects and really getting involved in teaching Asian Pacific American Studies. So I put it aside. And I'm actually now coming back around to the project. It'll eventually be produced as a series of vignettes that'll be web-based. So those people that you saw, well, hopefully you'll see them in some form again. The next clips that I want to show, which are 2 clips, are from another older piece that I did in 1998 called Umbilical Cord. And that project, many of my projects grow out of other projects, which are either because of courses that I've been teaching and or people and life experiences that I've been having. And with Umbilical Cord, it grew out of a workshop that I was doing at the University of the Philippines. I'd gotten an artist residency for a year to work on my own work. And I got so excited by what my workshoppers were doing that I decided, hey, I want to make a piece too. So Umbilical Cord was really inspired by the workshop, which was called Creating Presence for 100 Years of Filipino Women's Absence in History. And at 1998, that was the 100th year anniversary or commemoration of the Philippine independence from Spain. And it was the revolution against Spain. And then it was also an election year. So we can play those 2 clips back to back. And I think you'll all get a better sense of how I try to address how our history and the impact of Spanish and American colonialism, how I try to examine it in my work.
Okay, I'll minimize you and play them back to back, and then I'll bring you back up for any, closing thoughts you want to share. Does that sound good?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Crawling through Manila traffic day after day, all I can see as I pass miles of election posters, centennial flags, construction sites, billboards, and people is an umbilical cord. My mother's umbilical cord connects to her mother's umbilical cord and her mother's umbilical cord, on, stretching across the water, across regional and national boundaries, finally connecting to me and my unborn daughters. The image in my mind is of my grandmother, but I cannot imagine her youthfulness. I recall the last time I saw her. It was December 1981. She was 90 years old, and I was 18. I'd only met her 3 times before, and yet she was a goddess to me. A woman who possessed incredible powers. The many lines in her face, the strength in her hands, and the authority in her voice were affirmations of wisdom, her insatiable appetite for life. I could see the life breathing in her pores, beginning to tire. To create presence, one must go back into darkness.
Sino para sa iyong bayani? Jose Rizal. Ay, Andres Bonifacio!
Into intervals of pain and joy. Denial, discovery, and reconciliation. Creating presence for 100 years of absence of Filipino women's history. What was I thinking?
Ayun mga kilalang babaeng bayani. Opo, Melchor Aquino. Ate Dora Agoncillo. Ay, Melchor Agoncillo. Gumawa ng Balawat ng Pilipinas.
Blowing on the extinguishing embers until they reignite within all that we experience day to day. Blowing on the extinguishing embers until Filipino women's faces and their stories reappear in our imaginations.
Sino pang bayani natin? Dr. Rizal.
Si Dr. Jose Rizal. Siyang nakaano dito sa atin. Yung bang doktor na siya pa rin na nag-ano sa bayan. Namatay siya nang dahil sa bayan niya. Pinagtatanggol niya. Yun lang.
Ikaw muna, no? Sinong bayani mo?
Bayani ko! Bakit tinatanong yung bayani?
Kasi yun ang interview eh. Para sa project natin.
Ayan. Si Rizal na lang. Si Rizal? Oh, isang bayani yan. Bayani? Ha? Sino? Rizal? Rizal. Ginaldo.
My grandmother was 5 when the national hero Jose Rizal was executed by the Spaniards in 1896. She was 8 when the Philippine-American War broke out, a war written in indelible ink. Not in American history books, only as paragraphs here and there in Philippine history books. Yet there are images of American soldiers standing on mounds of skulls and bones piled up in mass graves, evidence of betrayal. 250,000 Filipinos dead, the official count. Women raped, children casualties of American expansionism. Sold for $20 million. Lolo Celestino was exiled in Hong Kong with Aguinaldo. Exile is in the blood. A mock battle, 1898. 2 flags are hoisted, American and Filipino. Kindness turns to deceit, re-Christianizing the savages. My grandmother never told me these stories.
That's it. Thanks. I think I'm just gonna stop and start our conversation because I think we need more time. So thank you for watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Angel. That was amazing. So here we are, the three of us, and I'm going to begin by bringing in Kathy Park Hong because I'm talking about Asian Americans. How can we not bring up Kathy Park Hong? I recently read a tweet from her. She quoted from Félix Guattari, who's a French psychoanalyst and writer. And this is the quote that Kathy Park Hong wrote in her tweet. The quote is, "A plurality of disparate groups coming together in a kind of unified disunity, a pragmatic solidarity without solidarity." Having read Kathy Park Hong's collection of essays, Minor Feelings and Asian American Reckoning, I couldn't help thinking that the quote from Guattari captures well the category or label AAPI. I wonder if you could talk a bit about this term, AAPI, and what this identity means to you as an American. Angel, do you want to start us off?
Okay, so, well, I'll start with the term in an academic setting context first, because as a kid growing up in the 70s, those terms didn't exist. And I think I grew up in I was an anomaly. I mean, growing up interracial, interreligious, mother, a public doctor, father, a record producer, stepfather, in a very, very white community. In many ways, we were extremely Filipino. We didn't know the language, but they made me go to like speech classes when I was 9 years old because I didn't pronounce things the way white Americans were, and they gave us fireballs as like rewards. And I was like, whoa, that's so weird. They're making your mouth hot. Like that's a reward. In any case, fast forward to early 90s, I was in a residency in Canada, and Peter Kwong, who was trying to put together, actually he had already established the Asian American Studies program at Hunter College. This was 1993. And there were no phones where I was in Banff. And they, I'd get a fax saying, Angel, would you like to teach Asian American Studies? And I was like, what is that? I had no idea what that was. And he said, just teach your life experiences. And back then too, or even before that, when I was in college, when I was in art school, I had done a photographic audio installation called Silent Stories. And then I published it. I made a book in 1985. And then 1993, I'm teaching what's being called Asian American Studies. And I thought, wow, yeah, this is my life, right? And I realized this term was actually much more than that. But at the same time, it was a certain kind of phrase that was locking us in, especially during that time when Filipinos were not really considered necessarily to be Asian American. I mean, we were actually also very different and very marginalized within this construct, right? And then later as at NYU, when I was teaching there, and the P came in for Asian Pacific American Studies. And then I remember by the mid 90s, the woman who's actually heading the Asian American Foundation now, Sonia Shaw, I think is her name.
Sonia Shaw. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she then, we had these long conversations, which were excellent, about Pacific Islanders. And I had a Tongan student who taught me a great deal about the differences between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And it's something that I still continue to learn. And it's, and that these labels, like history, because they're a part of history, I believe, need to be lived, actually, and continue to be redefined so that we don't get locked in. I mean, they're important, but yeah. Well, I hope I don't upset people. Anyway.
I would say the same thing, actually. I mean, what Cappy Park Hong's quoting, the French author on that. But that is that if you actually look at what the definition and the history and the origins of the term Asian American, that would have to look there. It was specific. It was it's a political term to create unity among, like a necessary unity among disparate groups that were unified by how we're treated, right? So that's the thing that we have in common. So despite, I think we see almost the naturalizing and the accepting of these terms that were constructed over time and have meant different things. Where do Middle Eastern people fall? We can just look to that example where there was a time when it was convenient for Armenians to be considered Asian, but then as policy and geopolitical interests change, then they become classified as white people, right? So then we have that example. We had states in the late 1800s that completely erased the category of Asian, of any type of Asian. So when we start actually believing that the political classification system for race that's evolved over time defines us, then we actually can see how it has, by its nature, erased entire generations of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in American history, including the commemoration that this event is celebrating, right, of that documented landing of Filipinos on this, so-called American soil. But really, for me, the start is there's how Asian Americans are perceived and how Pacific Islanders are perceived and then treated through the law, like the actual legal treatment, the social treatment, the treatment in the media. But I think once you start looking at the histories, they're actually very formulaic, because what happened in the Philippines, for instance, starting with the purchase of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines it wasn't just the Philippines, for $20 million and for all of the people inside of it. That is really actually formulaic of what then happened in Korea, literally just a couple of decades later. And then what happened in Korea became formulaic for what happened in Southeast Asia, starting in Vietnam and then other, Cambodia, Laos. So I think for me, Asian American is definitely about, we're trying to bring together people but who are actually defined by an externally defined, right? So I think that political history is really important. And just to throw the importance of ethnic studies and Asian American studies is like that, the birth of the term, right? It's coined as coming out of the movement, the youth-led movement for ethnic studies. Ethnic studies strikes at UC Berkeley. So it's interesting in the Bay Area. So it's like exciting to have that history at the San Francisco State University and UC Berkeley, those strikes that were not just about Asian Americans or any one group actually, but it was like the Third World Liberation Front, and it was about a much broader unity against militarization and against white supremacy, and how it was playing out across the world stage. So,
I wonder if we might move towards another question, and this is about language. Alison, I've noticed your use of Spanish in your poetry. And I wonder what your inclination is to use Spanish, what your relationship is with Spanish. And then a follow-up question, do you have a relationship with, and I'm making an assumption, this might be completely wrong, but do you have a relationship with Korean? I'm assuming that might be your parents' native language.
That would be an assumption that you're lucky is correct in this instance, but is definitely an assumption, and one that I think the use of Spanish in my work kind of does speak to that. So it's very odd. I grew up around Spanish a lot. As I grew up in a polycultural area. I'm from Queens. I actually grew up with a lot of Filipinos, a lot of Spanish-speaking people across different parts of Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. And so I had the pleasure of the privilege of being kind of around different communities and different tongues. I think for Korean, we were talking about religious colonialism and just how, I was just thinking of missionaries have preceded the military in every Asian Pacific Islander country. So the way that I understand Korean is very much through a Catholic church context, where kind of it was like, the way that I can understand like a Korean, the only time I'd ever really hear like a Korean funeral chant would be like mixed in with like a Roman Catholic or a Latin prayer. So that would probably be a lot. My relationship with Korean is very much about my parents, I think. And then I think for many immigrants, regardless of what, because I encountered this with people who speak any language, that their parents will either have to make a choice to either not teach them a language because they think it'll help their assimilation, or to then teach them a language, very aggressively because it then defines what somebody is. So am I really Korean if I don't speak Korean? So I think language is an area where Orientalism makes a lot of people assume that I should speak another language, but the reality is that I can talk about my personal story, but every time I talk about being Asian American, it is a political experience that I'm trying to talk about. So the reality is that many Korean Americans come to the United States as adoptees. This is increasingly true of any Asian American group. The United States is the creator, and actually specifically for born again Christians, is the creator of the adoption industry as we know it today after the Korean War, right? So I think language is a very hot issue. I have many adoptee friends who probably people would make that assumption, and that is touching on one of the deepest traumas of colonialism, of family separation through the adoption industry, transracial adoption industry. I think with Spanish, it's interesting because I'm not Asian Latino, but I grew up around in a community that had a lot of Argentinians who were Korean. So they were Korean American and they were also Latinx. There are also, if you look at migration patterns, there are many Asian Americans who come via Latin America. So I think it's one of the myths is that immigration is new. And I think another myth is that immigration is unilateral between like a foreign East and a Far East and then a modern West, where actually the reality is that people in the global South have been migrating between colonies for centuries. So that is not my family's case, but then I will find that like I will be asked the same idea of like how is it that you speak? It's like, oh, you speak really good Spanish or something, but it's the same idea of like how do I would be asked the same question in terms of me speaking really good English, as an Asian American. So I really do feel for and I've actually, as I teach Asians in the Americas, to really use my kind of multilingualness and the polycultural background to challenge Orientalism and to kind of ask people to like take it upon themselves to learn about the diaspora as well.
Sure.
Like fun fact, the Japanese internment in the United States was not only in the United States, it was like 11 countries across Latin America and Europe that agreed with, and the frameworks were in place in the 1930s that allowed them to basically detain and deport Japanese people and Korean people who were under Japanese colonial rule to basically be deported to the United States, detained and segregated from Japanese Americans. So it's really been like an international treatment when we look at the Asian American, Japanese American, Korean American, and diasporic experiences. Yeah.
Thank you, Alison. Angel, I wonder if I might ask you the same question about language. What are the various languages you reach for in creating your art?
Well, English is really the only language I know how to speak in terms of literally. And it's something that's extremely frustrating for me as someone who spends so much time abroad, and largely in the Philippines, but quite a bit in Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia. And I've had, been very, very fortunate that I've been able to go to different countries, also in Latin America, in Africa, and Europe. And especially in Asia, it's difficult because I'm mistaken for almost everything. And then, like, let's say if I'm in Mexico, depending on what I'm wearing, or Guatemala, I am indigenous. In Tibet, I was Tibetan. In Nepal, I'm Nepalese, and then if I open my mouth and I'm, a fairly loud person, people really freak out, and it's very difficult. I did a workshop in Luang Prabang in Laos a couple of years ago, and I can't speak Lao. I can't speak French. I had tattoos that were visible, and these kids who were children of tenant farmers were like, and so the language that I've learned to speak in every country that I'm in, every city, New York City, LA, San Francisco, doesn't matter. Any city I'm in or rural area that I'm in, I have to literally find the language in the heart, which is never easy, because what they see is this. It's the tyranny of appearances. And language, it is so crucial, because as we know, the English language, like US currency, has a lot of power. And when you're in another country and that is the only language you can literally speak, you do have to find other ways to communicate. And that is something that has taught me in leaps and bounds about how to be human and how to have unconditional kinds of respect, because you're out there with people that you're trying to communicate in some way, and yet you don't necessarily have the verbal, right? So this is something that I continue to live through, and it's quite exciting. And I've met many people that are also in those spaces that I call the cultures in between, right? We move in and out of these spaces. And I feel like these are ways that we need to continue trying to embrace difference, not fear difference, embrace it, right? And Alison, I just wanted to ask you, can I ask Alison a question, actually?
Absolutely.
So I think we're from different generations, and one of the things that that I feel, even though we're from different generations, that you and I are very fortunate to know our histories within the social, political, cultural contexts of activism, right? I'm wondering how we all teach, Seema, Alison, myself, we all teach. We as educators, how do we help these young generations now and future generations to understand what it means to embrace an identity that came, or identities that come from political activism, communities of activism that are not just paralleling, but they're intertwined. You know, how do you see us moving forward now, so that people can understand that and not fear, you know, the politics of it? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
And that's a question for you too, Seema, actually.
I mean,
Alison, I'll let you start.
Yeah. I mean, I think if the lessons of today have taught me anything, it's that anything can be co-opted, you know? So I think even our understanding of our racial identities, or even believing that that's something that is a fixed identity, or something that someone that you just have, and wasn't something that was created or that can be molded or redefined. I think that belief is like the first belief, is this idea that of self-determination, and the ability where all of these kind of like the Black liberation movement that inspired Asian American activists at that time, as well as this idea of self-determination, is that are we going to spend all of our energy around this, what are the divisions, like what makes each ethnic group this? Like, are we going to spend all of our energy talking about the classification system that defines us? Or are we going to spend our time and energy creating a new culture, or focusing on our own culture to elevate that and to do something transformative, right? So I think that, so whether that's not even having to say that one identity or one terminology is that, and I also think it's healthy for people to be able to talk about it and not assume that everybody has the same knowledge, because they don't. I think also, even in this conversation, we're assuming that it's actually really funny, because you just said that, Angel, that you didn't know about Asian American Studies until you started teaching it at Hunter University. It's at Hunter College, where I teach. So
that was 1993.
I know, and then Jennifer.
But the thing is, I knew. Okay, wait. Let me put that in your context. I was aware of what was happening on the West Coast, right? I knew my history of, Asian American Studies, the whole civil rights and beyond movements. I mean, I'm not ignorant. What I meant by, I've been in activism since I was 13, starting with, nuclear disarmament. What I meant by Asian American Studies, I guess I was sort of like, being raised the way that I was raised. Why do we need that? Right?
So that's very different. Yeah.
And so, I learned, there's a Buddhist saying, we teach what we want to learn ourselves. And because I grew up thinking that everyone was like me, I grew up thinking that people embrace difference. I was raised to love being different. I was bullied like so many other young people, even as an adult. You go through all this kind of stuff, but I didn't know that within a formal setting of teaching and learning, what this would quite mean. Okay, so when I was asked to teach Asian American Studies, because prior to this, I was teaching graduate school at New School, and I just graduated from graduate school, and I was teaching media studies and post-colonial issues. So and as an artist, I was doing that. So as an educator now, teach what's being called Asian American Studies. That was like, wow. And I'm still learning. I'm very excited to be going to Princeton, in a couple of months, because I have been away. And these new generations of young people it's their world. I'm totally excited to be engaging with them. Because the world that I was in is different.
we've had very different
Yeah.
relationships to it. So I think I didn't have the privilege of growing up with that. I think that that's a really big difference that I see between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that grew up on the West Coast and then who grew up in a country where they have been displaced historically or segregated or just definitely erased from national memory. So I think as an East Coast Asian who grew up in New York City, where now the population is like up to it's like close to, it's like between 1 in 5, 1 in 6 New Yorkers is Asian American Pacific Islander. But growing up, like, I think when you ask how do we transmit information to the next generation, it's the same. We can study what happened between our generations, for instance, where between every generation there is an ability to benefit from the fruits of the labor of the past generation, but there's a total loss of transmission. There's like no transmission of information. I think in terms of how the thing, because there's no evaluation, right? There's like a passing of the baton that I think could happen. But anyway, I also think that just romanticizes so many things, like the evolution of professional activism, which didn't really exist at the time that these political identities were being hashed out. Just the way the nonprofit sector kind of operates in changing culture and around racial narratives and things like that, I think is like a whole other conversation. But yeah, so I didn't have those things. And I attended Fordham University as an undergrad, which I learned now is like, oh my God, more than 30, it's like 30 to 40% Asian American student body. They don't have a single Asian American studies class. And to this day, they don't. And they didn't when I was there. They had this one, very like elderly guy it was a white guy who ran the like ancient Chinese civilization department, the traditional Orientalist department of study. And it was like one student group that sold dumplings and orchids. And it was and I'm seeing the same evolution of these like cultural symbols of identity that really don't have anything to do with Asian American as a political identity is something that I think that information has not been passed on. In some part, I think because like in New York, I can only speak to the communities that I grew up in. There is no such thing as Asian American identity, right? Because and the same thing would go for any, for a Latinx immigrant from a country, they don't arrive to the US being like, I'm Latinx, maybe more so now because of just the way racial identity has developed through media and technology. But race, as it's constructed here, is about the plurality, or it's about a bunch of people who have really very little in common other than a colonial history together, coming together and getting treated the same in the United States. So anyhow, so in New York, we didn't have that. We still don't. The program at Hunter has gone through many different changes, and in general, just academia has changed so much since the days that you were teaching there as well, that ethnic studies is just totally at risk of complete erasure.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do understand that. I mean, I left NYU in 2006 and and then I went back to Hunter and I taught there for like 3 years. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, things have changed a lot. And even, like I said, over the last 8 years, and I am very excited to interact more. And I mean, I was saying to Seema earlier that I would love to work more informally because a lot of the work that I've been doing abroad has been workshops and informal because there's a lot more that you can do in informal settings than when you need to get a grade or you need to get a diploma. And so many kids that I worked with can't get any of those things because they don't even have access to any kind of real education. But I do think that we are in this incredible, exciting, and yet also tense place where we're at different levels and life experiences and ways in which we process life itself, right? And that, I mean, just hearing both of us speaking, you can hear that, and the different generations and how we were raised, and me being Filipino, you being Korean, Seema, we haven't heard you speak yet, but you being South Asian, right?
I'm the person who asked the question.
I'm going to be quiet because I realized that we haven't heard from any of the audience.
Yes, if you have a question, please go ahead and put it on the chat board or in the ask a question box. I did want to ask Angel and Alison just a question about the rise in anti-Asian racism. 6 months have passed since the first stories of anti-Asian racism became part of media coverage. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts were when you, heard these stories, for the first time, just, broke in the media. What were your thoughts?
So other than my cultural work and that identity, I do a lot in Asian American media. So I run a scraper. I work with a team of students who developed an original scraper that gathers the news. So the first thing that I see, though, is how we begin to normalize like visuals of violence against Asian Americans. Like we start to visualize bloodied, beaten Asian faces and bodies, and in some cases children, women, elderly people, and those images are repeated over and over. They go viral, and then I see like a viral reaction that starts to happen to that, where first that somehow that moment is ahistoric, but it is not, right? So I think for me, it has to give me strength and give me that like energy to keep going when I think of all of the people, the millions and millions of people who have suffered from anti-Asian violence before. So this is something that Asian Americans have survived before and have contended with before. And actually that defines Asian Americans, actually, because there's not a single Asian American or Pacific Islander group that didn't experience staggering levels of death, genocide, near genocide levels of death, the Korean War, the Philippines, just like within a weekend, the kind of numbers and the lives that get taken. So we have to take strength and think of this as like I immediately think of our like political ancestors, right? Like who are the people who have suffered before and what can we do so that none of this is like that we're actually changing things rather than normalizing that violence. So that was like where my mind went. And also just, yes, of course, sadness, and then sending my love to the people who were harmed.
Angel, how about you? We just have a couple of minutes remaining.
When I first started hearing about everything from Black Lives Matters, when George Floyd was murdered, I was in Breonna Taylor. I was in the Philippines, and my life was it was weird. I didn't have a TV, so I would have to try to find whatever I could on YouTube. And I found myself starting to obsess on whatever I could get of images from YouTube of what was happening. And one day I just started crying and then throwing things at my wall because I was so upset, thinking we failed, actually. I felt like, or I was wondering how other people in my generation felt, and older people that inspired me, who were part of those movements in California, in the Bay Area. And I was really, really devastated by these crimes. And, as I started to reach out to my friends and colleagues, my family, and finding out, how they're dealing with these things in the US, I wondered, how was I going to deal with it now that I'm back? And two people I knew were brutally beaten. There were a couple of people that I'm close to who knew one of the other Pinais who was beaten. And all that kept going through my head, that continues to go through my head, is that we need to keep using education, which is the last bastion of freedom, freedom of expression, freedom to be a human being. And what does that take? What does that entail? I mean, I think, we have so much work to do with each other, for each other, wherever we can, whenever we can, and still be able to figure out how do we take those moments of incredible violence, because as Alison said, I mean, our histories are coming out of violence, are coming out of, in many of our cases, persecution, and we're also pitted against each other, right? We come out of these histories where we're enemies. And what does it mean now that we've emigrated, or we've been born and raised in the United States of America, and we're thrown together, and we have grandparents that don't like each other or whatever, and this is not just amongst Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. It's beyond that. So yeah, I mean, audience, I wish we could see you. This kind of thing really drives me nuts. I'm really sorry, but
so we're at the end of our time. Angel,
sorry.
Thank you. Alison, thank you. Alison, did you respond to the question about how audience members can find your poetry? Angel, there's also a question about how audience members can find your films.
Umbilical cord is distributed.
A resource for.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, for her poetry. Okay, so let me just wrap it up now. I just want to thank Alison and Angel so very much. What a wonderful conversation. Before we go, I want to post on the chat board a link to a document that has a treasure trove of resources gathered by Make Us Visible New Jersey. I'm going to do that right now. Here we go. And is that hyperlinked?
No.
Okay, I'll try that again. Yeah. Connie, maybe you could help me out there. So Connie's going to put the hyperlink there, and I just want to say a couple of things about the resource. These resources are educational websites geared to addressing the inclusion of AAPI studies in the K-12 curricula. Some of the websites like Asian American Education Project, based in California, and Immigrant History Initiative, based out of our home state, provide lesson plans, which I know as a teacher helps so much when including new material in classroom teaching. I like to end by saying Asian American history is American history. Asian American literature is American literature. Thank you, everyone. And on the chat board, you can see that Connie's put the link to the resources that Make Us Visible has created. So please check it out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. What a fantastic program. Thank you to our presenters and moderators for being here. And we encourage you to visit the library's website if you'd like to learn about future events. And we wish you all well. Thank you for being a wonderful audience, and good night.